we're still at the tip of the iceberg. But the fact is, I don't think Facebook has put the resources, the time. My understanding is they didn't even go back and check all those accounts to see if they had put out other ads.
Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia after Facebook admitted it sold $150,000 worth of ads in the 2016 election to groups linked to Russia, spurring investigations by both congressional committees and special counsel Robert Mueller. And we're back now with the panel. Speaker Gingrich, how big a development is this? And are we beginning to see the end of Washington's hands-off approach to big tech and especially these huge internet companies?
Yeah, look, I think this is probably 4 to 6 years behind the curve. These companies are so big. They control so much of our lives. They can set so many different policies internally with no supervision, that having not just the Russian angle, but really looking at the underlying nature of these companies, what they do, how they make decisions. These are the equivalent of gigantic public utilities. And in the information age, they have enormous power. And I don't think in a free society, you can have power that's hidden away in secret, controlled by a handful of billionaires.
Well, one of the things that Mark Warner, who is a tech guy himself before he went into politics, said is it's the wild, wild west there. Now, some people would say that's one of the reasons it succeeded. Are you saying put government clamps on it?
Look, I think having the wild, wild west when companies are small is exactly right. But several of these companies are so enormous that there's some sense of what does it mean to us as a free society to have global corporations run by founding billionaires who have been in effect totally out of control and who internally can wipe out a company, they can be anti-conservative, they can be anti-liberal, they can do all sorts of things, and there's been almost no supervision just to surface the information.
Rachel, President Obama and Democrats, I think you'd agree, generally had a pretty cozy relationship with the big internet companies like Facebook, like Google, like Amazon. Is that changing on Capitol Hill now, as the Speaker suggested it should? And is there a partisan divide in how Republicans and Democrats see these internet behemoths?
Yeah, absolutely. The days of the industry sort of basking in this endless praise from Washington are basically coming to an end right now. Look, for a long time, Congress had sort of a light touch with the tech industry, but now you have Democrats who are furious about these Russia-linked ads that ran in 2016. Republicans are worried that Google is oppressing conservative voices. Both sides are concerned about people's private information being gathered and what happens if they're hacked. And so those are all concerns. So yes, generally Republicans control everything right now in Washington, and they're typically anti-regulation, but it's safe to say that this sort of darling industry is now becoming a target as much as anything else.
And do you have any thought about how you do it? The rubber hits the road. How do you allow these companies to grow and prosper, but with some guardrails?
I think that's the question that the Hill is sort of grappling with right now. How do they do this but allow an industry to continue to grow that influences everyone's lives so much? Look, there's a test case that's going on right now on Capitol Hill. There's going to be some hearings coming up in the Senate this week to examine whether big websites and tech companies can be held liable for child sex trafficking on the internet. Right now, they cannot be sued if a user were to put illicit content on the internet. So the Senate is going to look at re-examining this. The tech industry is putting a lot of money into K Street to lobby against this. But I think this is an interesting first test, right? Like if they're not going to see something as heinous as child sex trafficking as a reason to regulate, then it's safe to say that big tech is still has a lot of power.
It's fun, you talk about K Street. It is amazing, which is the big center of lobbying here in Washington. And there was a chart in the Wall Street Journal that showed the lobbying expenditures by these companies has just skyrocketed in the last few years. Julie, where are President Trump and his administration on this? You talk about utilities, Speaker Gingrich. Steve Bannon used to talk about treating Facebook and Google as public utilities, which meant heavy regulation.
Right, Steve Bannon, of course, now outside the White House, though. Look, at least rhetorically, the position of this White House when it comes to big tech is so different from the Obama administration, which really wrapped its arms around the Googles and Amazons and Facebooks and presented them as examples of American companies that are growing strong and are dominating on the global stage. Trump, I think, has been turned off a bit by the fact that some of the leaders of these companies are not particularly pleased with his administration and have spoken out on a lot of issues. I don't think you can divorce this conversation when it comes to the White House from that. But he's also taken on Amazon, and not just for Jeff Bezos' role in owning the Washington Post. He's taken on Amazon on his Twitter account. I think that you are seeing some of this stemming from the president's populist message in general as well. I mean, he looks at Wall Street and some of the big firms there, and I think looks at tech in somewhat of the same way, a massive company that it can get out of control. And when he looks at his base, he can see their frustration with that, the frustration of small business owners who see themselves getting taken over by a giant like Amazon.
Yeah, there's also this whole question, before I get to you, Guy, about the fact that internet companies, when they have sales, they don't have to pay taxes, but the mom and pop store in the town on Main Street does have to pay taxes.
And that's what you've seen him go after Amazon in particular for. He's done this in a series of tweets. I think it'll be interesting to see if this comes up in the discussion on the Hill on tax reform, if we do end up talking about a big tax reform package.
That would actually add a lot of revenue, wouldn't it?
Indeed.
That would really, that would get the lobbyists busy. Guy, there's another aspect of all of this that I want to get to, and that's growing questions about the culture in Silicon Valley. You had 3 former female employees of Google just file what they hope will be a class action lawsuit charging them with pay and promotion discrimination. And as you know, there have been a number of complaints and lawsuits alleging sexual harassment in these companies. So that wild, wild west attitude applies also to the culture in Silicon Valley.
That's right. So you'll have Democrats in particular, I think, focusing on those problems and equal pay and is there discrimination in Silicon Valley. And then you'll have on the other side, as Rachel alluded to, a lot of conservatives and Republicans look at what happened at Mozilla a few years ago and Brendan Eich ousted from that company for having traditional views on marriage, and then the firing of that engineer at Google. Is there rampant discrimination in terms of viewpoints against conservatives, and how might that play out in terms of average users having information potentially stifled in searches? There are real concerns about that on the right. So big tech might be waking up these days and saying, uh-oh, we have real problems culturally on the left and the right in this country, and that could be a problem for us on Capitol Hill as lawmakers on both sides start to dig in.
But I want to pick up on something that I asked Speaker Gingrich, because there's no question that these companies have been engines of huge economic growth in this country. Is there a downside to Washington, or obviously there's a downside? How big a downside is there to Washington getting more involved in regulation of the internet?
A huge downside. I think some of the concerns that the speaker raised are fair and reasonable, and people would agree with them. My faith in the ability of government to respond to that well through regulation is very low. I think government is slow-moving, it is the opposite of innovative, and the internet is a miracle, and it wouldn't exist as it does today if the government's clumsy hand had been on its neck from day one. And I think putting more hand on the neck and applying more pressure from D.C., I'm just not sure that works out well.
15 seconds to respond, Speaker.
First of all, the internet was created by ARPANET, a Department of Defense project. Second, the fact is there's no time in American history when huge concentrations of power are not directly challenged by government, and that's overall been good for protecting our liberty.
All right, we'll continue this debate. This is an important subject, and we'll keep talking about it. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.